The crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom trembled as the seventh richest man in America suddenly dropped to his knees in the middle of his wedding. 3,000 guests instantly rose to their feet. Some stood there with their mouths wide open. Some whispered that he had gone completely insane, and others quietly pulled out their phones, convinced they were witnessing what would become the biggest scandal in America. Amid the suffocating whispers, Malcolm Jefferson, the man who owned towering skyscrapers, private jets, and wealth beyond what most people could ever dream of in a lifetime, was trembling as he knelt before a young woman wearing a wedding dress so simple. Many thought she was just a maid who had accidentally walked into the palpate ceremony. And her, Amina Brooks, a poor housemaid raised in a working-class neighborhood in the American South, was crying so hard that her hands could barely hold her wedding bouquet. But at the exact moment Malcolm lifted the wedding ring, the giant LED screen behind the stage suddenly lit up. A hospital video appeared, and just 10 seconds later, not a single person in that room of 3,000 dared to breathe too loudly. Because the woman they had just mocked had once slept on the cold hospital floor for 47 straight nights, just to keep this man alive. Some people enter our lives carrying neither wealth, nor fame, nor status, yet they bring something far more precious than all of it. A love powerful enough to pull someone back from death's door. If you still believe that gratitude, sacrifice, and true love still exist in this world, subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss stories that can change your heart forever. And before this story begins, leave a comment below. Where are you listening from? New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, or from a small corner somewhere else in the world? Stay until the very last second, because what you're about to hear about Malcolm Jefferson and Amina Brooks will make you realize this. The richest person is not the one who owns the most, but the one lucky enough to find someone willing to stay awake through endless nights just so they can live. Atlanta, a city of towering glass skyscrapers rising beneath the Southern American sky, where money determines status and power, defines a person. There was one name that nearly everyone in finance, technology, and politics lowered their voices to mention: Malcolm Jefferson. A 42-year-old black man, founder of Jefferson Dynamics, a technology empire valued at over $8 billion, with artificial intelligence systems stretching from America to Europe. The media called him the Steel Lion of Peachtree Street. Investors called him the man who never loses. But to those who had worked for Malcolm, he had another name: the man without a heart. Malcolm's mansion sat on the hills of Buckhead, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Atlanta. Its iron gates stood nearly 4 meters high, always closed. A line of supercars rested in the underground garage. A private helicopter waited behind gardens large enough to look like a public park. He had everything: money, fame, power, hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts, private dinners with senators, bankers, and movie stars. But there was one thing Malcolm had buried long ago: his faith in love. 7 years earlier, the woman he had once loved more than his own life had walked away, taking half of his company shares, and a man 10 years younger than she was. The divorce had dominated headlines across America. People talked about the settlement, the stocks, the assets. No one knew. What Malcolm had truly lost was his ability to trust another human being. From that day on, he changed. He no longer smiled. He stopped attending parties. He no longer believed a single sweet word. He worked 18 hours a day, signed contracts like a machine, and fired employees without blinking. Inside Jefferson Dynamics, there was an unwritten rule: never look Malcolm Jefferson in the eyes for more than 3 seconds. Because if he noticed you trembling, you wouldn't have a job tomorrow. That morning, a thin layer of mist covered Atlanta. The early sunlight streamed through the giant glass windows of the Jefferson estate. Everything was proceeding as usual. The household staff stood in line. The chef prepared breakfast. His personal secretary reviewed his meeting schedule. Malcolm descended the staircase wearing a hand-tailored black suit. The Swiss watch on his wrist reflected an icy light. He said nothing. No one dared breathe too loudly until the front door opened. A young woman walked in. The sound of an old suitcase rolling across polished marble echoed slowly, completely out of place in such suffocating luxury. Every eye turned toward her. She wore a white shirt with a worn collar, canvas shoes so old the stitching was nearly coming apart. Her curly black hair was neatly tied back. warm brown skin, no makeup. But her eyes shone in a way no one could explain. The elderly butler stepped forward and quietly asked, "Are you the new girl?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. My name is Amina." Her full name was Amina Brooks, 23 years old, orphaned at 12. Raised in Bankhead, a neighborhood where police sirens were heard more often than school bells. She had washed dishes in diners, cleaned tables at gas stations, mel hotel biz, worked 3 jobs at once just to survive. And today, she was here, inside a mansion where the monthly electric bill alone could support the entire neighborhood where she grew up. Malcolm stood at the top of the staircase. His steel-cold eyes stopped on the small young woman holding her worn suitcase. The entire room fell silent, a silence so deep, people could hear their own heartbeats. He looked at her from head to toe. No emotion, no curiosity, only the cold gaze of a man silently evaluating an object. Then he asked, his voice low, sharp as a blade, "Do you know where you are?" Amina looked up, straight into Malcolm's eyes. She didn't lower her head. She didn't tremble. "Yes, sir, I do." "Then you know." Malcolm began walking down the staircase, one step at a time. "That if you make even one mistake," his footsteps echoed across the marble, "you'll be fired immediately." Every employee held their breath. No one had ever dared look Malcolm Jefferson in the eyes like that. But Amina smiled, just slightly, a smile that made the entire room freeze. "Mr. Jefferson," she spoke slowly, "I grew up in a place where making one mistake," she tightened her grip on her old suitcase, "could get you killed." She paused, then looked directly into his eyes. "Losing a job," her voice remained calm, "is not the scariest thing." For the first time in many years, Malcolm Jefferson stood completely still. His eyes changed. Only for a second. Only slightly. But enough for everyone in that room to realize something had just begun to change inside that mansion that had never known warmth. And the very first job given to Amina Brooks was to kneel down, pick up a cleaning cloth, and polish every piece of marble beneath the feet of the richest man in Atlanta. No one knew that the young woman cleaning that floor would one day become the only person who could make Malcolm Jefferson kneel, in tears. The very first day Amina Brooks stepped into the Jefferson mansion, she understood one thing very clearly: this place was not meant for the weak. Every marble tile beneath her feet was polished so perfectly that she could see the reflection of her own exhausted face. Priceless paintings hung on the walls worth more than the old house she once lived in. Crystal chandeliers dangled from impossibly high ceilings, like something from a royal palace, casting a cold, luxurious glow, but not a trace of warmth. Amina stood in the middle of the grand hall, her fingers tightly gripping a cleaning cloth. She knew exactly who she was. A poor maid. A brown-skinned girl from a neighborhood that wealthy people in Atlanta only mentioned with pity in their eyes. But she also knew something else. She needed this job. Needed every single dollar to pay for her tiny rented room, to buy medicine for her aunt, and to send a little money home for her younger cousin, who was still in school. That morning, Malcolm Jefferson had an important meeting at the mansion. From early dawn, the entire house was stretched tight like a violin string. The chef didn't dare let his knife strike too hard against the cutting board. The butler walked without making a sound. The staff lowered their heads so deeply they barely dared look at anyone. Because today, Malcolm was meeting 3 major investors from New York City. A contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars sat waiting on the table. And if anything went wrong, someone would lose their job. Amina was assigned to bring coffee into the main sitting room. Just a silver tray, 4 cups of black coffee, a small pitcher of milk, a few cubes of white sugar. But to her, it felt as heavy as her entire fate. She took a deep breath and stepped forward carefully. Inside the room, Malcolm Jefferson stood beside a towering glass window, dressed in a custom-made black suit tailored in Italy. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face cold and sculpted like stone. He didn't need to speak. Just by standing there, the entire room fell silent. Amina lowered her head and placed the tray on the table. Everything should have ended smoothly. But at that exact moment, one of the guests suddenly turned, his elbow striking the tray. A cup of hot coffee slipped from Amina's hand. Crash. Then the dark stream of coffee splashed directly across Malcolm Jefferson's chest. The entire room froze. No one breathed. No one blinked. Malcolm's $20,000 suit was stained with a large brown mark. The butler turned pale. A nearby waitress covered her mouth. The three investors exchanged glances, as though they had just witnessed a death sentence being announced. Amina stood frozen. Her hands trembled from the heat of the coffee. Her throat tightened. She knew. For men like Malcolm, one small mistake was enough to make someone disappear from this house forever. Malcolm slowly lowered his gaze to the stain on his suit. Then he looked up. His eyes stopped on Amina. Cold, deep, terrifying. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" His voice was quiet, but somehow far more frightening than a scream. Amina could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The butler hurried forward. "Mr. Jefferson, I'll handle this immediately. She's new, Malcolm raised one hand. The room fell silent again. He didn't look at the butler, only at Amina. "I asked you." Amina swallowed hard. In her mind flashed images of her damp little apartment, her aunt coughing endlessly, stacks of unpaid bills. All she had to do was lower her head, cry, bye. Maybe she would still have a chance. But in that moment, Amina saw something else. She saw how everyone in this room feared Malcolm so much they had forgotten they were human. She saw the cold silence inside this enormous house where not a single laugh existed. And in the eyes of this wealthy man, she saw more than anger. She saw a loneliness so deep, it was almost heartbreaking. Amina bent down, picked up the white cloth beneath the tray, wiped a few drops of coffee from the floor, then stood up straight. "Mr. Jefferson," her voice was soft, but clear. "I'm sorry." The room remained silent. Malcolm narrowed his eyes slightly. Amina looked straight at him. Not challenging, not disrespectful, just strangely calm. "But that suit is not more valuable than a human being." The air seemed to split in two. The butler's eyes widened. One of the investors froze mid-motion. A young waitress nearly dropped a silver plate. No one could believe that a poor maid on her very first day had dared say such words to Malcolm Jefferson. Malcolm stood motionless. For a long time, long enough that Amina thought she could hear the faint rain tapping against the glass. His eyes remained locked on hers. But this time, there was something different in them. Not just anger. Something like memory, like pain, like an old wound someone had accidentally touched. "What did you just say?" he asked. Amina tightened her grip on the cloth. "I said, I ruined your suit. I'll take responsibility. I can work overtime. You can deduct my pay. I can leave if that's what you want." She paused. "But please, don't look at me as if I'm just a stain on your clothes." That sentence made the entire room feel colder. Malcolm said nothing. He simply stared at her. And for one very brief moment, Amina saw his expression change. Not the face of a billionaire, not the face of a boss, but the face of a man who had been hurt so deeply that he had learned to hide behind coldness just to survive. One of the investors cleared his throat. "Mr. Jefferson, perhaps we should continue the meeting." Malcolm slowly removed his suit jacket. The butler rushed forward to take it. Everyone thought he was about to fire Amina on the spot. But instead, Malcolm simply said, "Get her a new apron." Amina froze. Even the butler looked stunned. "Sir?" Malcolm turned and walked toward the staircase. "And bring another coffee." That was all. No shouting, no firing, no punishment. But to everyone in that room, it was impossible to believe. Because Malcolm Jefferson had never forgiven anyone that easily. As Amina bent down to pick up the shattered porcelain pieces, her hands trembled. Not from fear anymore, but because she knew, from that moment on, her life in this mansion would never be peaceful again. And from that moment, the fates of Amina Brooks and Malcolm Jefferson had become forever intertwined. On a stormy night in late autumn, Atlanta was swallowed by thunder. Outside the Jefferson mansion, ancient trees bent violently in the wind. Rain slammed against the glass windows like thousands of fingers knocking on that cold, lifeless house. On the third floor, inside his massive office, Malcolm Jefferson was still sitting at his desk. It was nearly 2 in the morning. In front of him lay stacks of financial reports, investment contracts, and urgent emails from New York City, London, and Singapore. The blue glow of his computer screen reflected across his exhausted face. Malcolm was used to this, used to being alone, used to long nights filled with nothing but the sound of his keyboard and a glass of unfinished whiskey. He had always believed that if he became strong enough, rich enough, cold enough, no one would ever be able to hurt him again. But that night, his body betrayed him. A sharp pain shot straight through his chest. Malcolm froze. His hand pressed against his heart. At first, he thought it was just exhaustion, just stress, just another passing ache. But then the pain spread down his left arm, squeezing his chest like an invisible hand. He tried to stand. His leather chair slid backward. The whiskey glass crashed onto the hardwood floor, shattering into pieces. The sound echoed through the silent room. Malcolm grabbed the edge of his desk, struggling to breathe. For the first time in years, the man who had made an entire city fear him could no longer control his own breath. Downstairs, Amina Brooks was finishing her late shift. She had just folded towels in the laundry room when she heard a loud crash upstairs. Every other employee had already gone home. The mansion was nearly empty. Amina looked up. A chill ran down her spine. She dropped her coat and ran upstairs. "Mr. Jefferson?" No answer. She pushed open the office door, and her heart nearly stopped. Malcolm Jefferson had collapsed beside his desk, one hand clutching his chest, his face pale, sweat pouring down his forehead. That tall, browed, cold-hearted man was now lying on the floor like any other fragile human being. Amina rushed to his side. "Mr. Jefferson, can you hear me?" Malcolm forced his eyes open. His lips trembled. "Don't call anyone." Amina froze. Even now, standing on the edge of death, he was still clinging to that heartbreaking pride. She grabbed his hand firmly. "No." Her voice was steady. "Not this time. You don't get to give orders." She called 911. Then the butler. Then she ran through the freezing rain to open the front gates. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights tore through the darkness of Buckhead. Paramedics rushed into the mansion. Malcolm was placed on a stretcher, hooked to oxygen, connected to heart monitors. As they wheeled him outside, Malcolm's hand suddenly slipped off the edge of the stretcher. Amina didn't know why, but she grabbed it tightly. "You're going to be okay," she whispered. Malcolm didn't answer. His eyes slowly closed beneath the ambulance lights. That night, he was rushed to Emory University Hospital in critical condition. The heart attack had hit hard. Doctors raced against every second. The emergency room doors slammed shut right in front of Amina. A nurse looked at her. "Are you family?" Amina went silent. That question hurt more than she expected. She wasn't family, not his wife, not his daughter, not his blood. She was barely more than a maid who had only worked there for a short time. But when she looked around the hospital hallway, there was no one, no family, no friends, no one who belonged to Malcolm. Amina quietly said, "I'm the only one who came with him." The nurse looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Then wait here." Amina sat down on the cold plastic chair outside the emergency room. Rain continued falling against the windows. Malcolm's phone kept ringing inside the hospital belongings bag. She looked at the screen. His assistant, his attorney, his CFO, investment partners. But strangely, not a single call from family. No one asking, "Is he in pain? Is he still alive? Is he scared?" The first caller only asked, "Will Jefferson Dynamics stock be affected?" Amina tightened her grip on the phone. She didn't answer. The second caller asked, "Is tomorrow's meeting canceled?" The third asked, "Should we prepare a press statement?" Amina turned the phone off. Her throat tightened. The whole world knew Malcolm Jefferson's name. All of America knew his fortune. But now, while he lay somewhere between life and death, all they cared about were numbers. That night, Amina never went home. She stayed in that hallway until morning. And when the doctor finally came out, his expression grim, she jumped to her feet. "How is he?" The doctor removed his mask. "We got through the most critical stage." He paused. "But his condition is still serious. He'll need intensive monitoring." Amina let out a shaky breath. Her knees nearly gave out. She didn't understand why she felt so relieved. She only knew that hearing he was alive felt like her own heart had started beating again. Day one, she stayed. No one asked her to. No one offered overtime. The butler called and told her to go home. Amina simply said, "I'll leave when he wakes up." Day two, she stayed. She fell asleep on a plastic chair. Her thin coat draped over her shoulders. Her meals came from a vending machine. Day three, She had memorized the smell of antiseptic, the sound of doctors' footsteps, the steady beeping of ICU monitors. The nurses began recognizing the small, brown-skinned girl who always sat at the end of the hallway. One of them asked, "What are you to him?" Amina stared at Malcolm's door for a long time, then quietly answered, "Maybe. The person who doesn't want him to wake up alone." 10 nights later, rain fell once again. The hallway was nearly empty. Amina curled up on the cold tile floor outside Malcolm's ICU room, using her old coat as a blanket. The hospital floor chilled her to the bone. The fluorescent lights burned her tired eyes. But she stayed, like a silent promise, that when Malcolm Jefferson opened his eyes, even if the whole world had abandoned him, he would still see someone waiting. And that very night, inside the ICU, somewhere between sleep and consciousness, Malcolm slowly opened his eyes. Through the foggy glass, he saw a small figure curled up in the hallway, an old coat across her shoulders, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. He couldn't see her face clearly, but he knew. It was Amina, the only person who didn't need him to sign a check, didn't need his power, didn't need his promises, yet still stayed. A single tear quietly slid down the face of the man, once known as the man without a heart. He couldn't speak, couldn't call her name, but deep inside, a door had begun to open, slowly, painfully. And from that night on, Malcolm Jefferson understood something. Some people don't walk into your life asking for a place in it. They walk in to remind you that even a heart you thought was long dead can still be brought back to life by the kindness of someone who never owed you anything. Because she couldn't afford a room near the hospital, Amina Brooks had only one choice: stay in the hallway. Every night, when the clock on the wall crept past midnight, when the doctor's footsteps became fewer, when the families of other patients slowly left in search of warm beds, Amina would quietly pull her old coat from her canvas bag. The elbows were worn thin. The zipper was half broken. It still carried the scent of rain and cheap soap. She would spread it across the cold tile floor, right outside the ICU room of Malcolm Jefferson. Then she would lie on her side, pulling her knees close to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself just to stay warm. It was no place for sleep. The hospital lights were so white they made her eyes ache. The smell of disinfectant filled every breath. The steady beeping of heart monitors echoed through the night. Sometimes a mother's cry drifted from the far end of the hallway. Sometimes a doctor rushed past, his white coat fluttering in the freezing air, but Amina stayed. Night 1, night 2, night 7, then night 15. No one asked her to do it. No one paid her. No contract in the world said a maid should sleep on a hospital floor, waiting for her employer to wake up. And yet, Amina stayed. Because every time she looked through the small glass window of Malcolm's ICU room, she saw him lying motionless among IV lines, breathing tubes, and pale blue lights. The man who had once made all of Atlanta bow their heads was now so fragile, he needed machines just to help him breathe. And somehow, that made her heart ache in a way she didn't understand. During the day, she sat in a plastic chair beside his door. She read old newspapers to pass the time. She whispered prayers under her breath. She asked nurses if she could stand outside his room for just a few minutes whenever they changed his medication. Some afternoons, her only meal was a pack of dry crackers and water from a public fountain. Some evenings, she wiped her old shoes with tissues. As if trying to hold on to the last piece of dignity she had in a place where everyone looked at her like she didn't belong. News about Malcolm Jefferson still dominated television. Financial channels talked about stocks. Analysts discussed the future of his empire. Competitors quietly waited for his company to crumble. But no one, not one person, talked about the girl sleeping in the hallway. No one knew that every night, when the hospital sank into its coldest silence, Amina stayed awake every time the rhythm of Malcolm's machines changed. She was afraid. Afraid a doctor might suddenly run into his room. Afraid the ICU doors might open and a serious face would walk out. Afraid that Malcolm Jefferson might leave this world without hearing someone tell him, "You're not alone." On the 23rd night, a nurse named Martha found Amina trembling from the cold. She stopped, looked at the girl curled up on the floor, and her heart broke a little. "Sweetheart, why don't you go home?" Amina slowly sat up, pulling the coat over her shoulders. "I don't have a car," she smiled weakly, "and going back and forth every day costs too much." Martha sighed. "But you're not family." Amina stayed silent for a moment, then looked toward Malcolm's door. I know. Then why are you still here? Amina smiled again. A tired smile, so fragile, it almost shattered. Because if he wakes up, I don't want him to see an empty hallway. Martha couldn't say another word. From that day on, she began saving Amina a cup of hot soup at the end of every shift. Another nurse brought her an old pair of socks. A young doctor occasionally left a folding chair in the corner, but Amina rarely used it. She preferred staying close to Malcolm's door, close enough that if anything happened, she would be the first to know. Little by little, everyone in the ICU began to know her. They no longer called her the billionaire's maid. They called her something else. The hallway angel. The name started with Martha. One morning, after seeing Amina gently helping an elderly woman find her husband's room, Martha smiled and whispered to another nurse, "That girl, she's the angel of this hallway." And the name spread. The nurses called her that. The night security guards called her that. Even the families of other patients began noticing the small brown-skinned girl with kind eyes and cracked hands. Amina wasn't just waiting for Malcolm anymore. She helped a mother buy coffee when the woman was too afraid to leave her son's room. She picked up a fallen scarf for an old man who could barely walk. She sat beside a young woman crying after her father's dangerous surgery. She had no money, no status, no power, but she had something rare in that hospital, a heart that didn't know how to ignore someone else's pain. On the 31st night, Malcolm showed signs of improvement. He opened his eyes, just for a few seconds. But it was enough for the doctors to say, "Hope is coming back." When Amina heard that, she burst into tears right there in the hallway. She turned away, covered her mouth, trying not to make a sound. Martha wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "He's going to live, sweetheart." Amina nodded, but she didn't let herself celebrate, because she knew the fight wasn't over. And then, on the 47th night, rain fell over Atlanta once again. Not as violent as the night Malcolm collapsed, but colder, longer, as if trying to wash away every last piece of pride he had left. Inside the ICU, Malcolm Jefferson slowly opened his eyes. This time, for real. The ceiling lights burned his vision. His throat felt dry. His chest still ached. He heard machines. He heard rain. He heard his own weak breathing. Then, he turned his head. Through the ICU glass, he saw the hallway. And there, Amina was curled up on the floor, her old coat beneath her, one shoulder exposed because the blanket wasn't big enough. Her bare feet pulled tightly together from the cold. Her cracked hands resting over her chest, red from days of washing, cleaning, waiting. And yet, there was still a faint smile on her lips. As if even in the deepest exhaustion, she was still dreaming of something beautiful. Malcolm stared at her for a very long time. And for the first time, he didn't see a maid, didn't see poverty, didn't see an employee. He only saw someone who stayed. Stayed when his family was gone. Stayed when his friends disappeared. Stayed when business partners only called about stocks. Stayed when he no longer had power. Stayed when he was nothing more than a broken man behind glass. Not knowing if he would live to see morning, Malcolm tried to lift his hand. Too weak. Tried to say her name. No sound came. One tear slipped from his eye. Then another. Then another. The man who never cried when he lost his wife. Never cried when his mother died. Never cried when the world called him heartless. Was now crying like a child. Just because a poor girl had slept on a hospital floor, waiting for him to wake up. And in that moment, Malcolm Jefferson understood something he had never learned in all his years of wealth. Some debts can never be paid with money. Some love never needs to be spoken. And sometimes, the person who brings your heart back to life is the one who never asked for anything at all. When Malcolm Jefferson was discharged from the hospital, all of Atlanta knew about it. News flashed across giant screens downtown. Reporters crowded the hospital gates. Jefferson Dynamics stock began climbing again. Business partners sent flowers. Old friends sent their congratulations. And the same people who had stayed silent through all 47 nights he lay in the ICU suddenly appeared with wide smiles and sympathetic words. But Malcolm no longer looked at them the way he once had. After the heart attack, he had lost weight. His face was still stern. His posture was still straight. His suits were still expensive. But in his eyes, something had changed. A silence. A crack. A gratitude so deep He didn't even know what to call it. As his private car pulled away from the hospital, Malcolm looked through the tinted window. Behind the crowd of reporters, Amina Brooks stood quietly beside a street lamp. She didn't push forward, didn't wave, didn't try to let the cameras see her. She simply stood there, wearing the same old coat she had spread across the hospital floor for 47 nights. When their eyes accidentally met, Amina smiled, a very small smile. Then she turned and walked away. No demon, no expectations, no need for anyone to remember her name. And somehow, that moment hurt Malcolm more than the surgical scar in his chest. Because for the first time in his life, he understood something. Some people do good, not because they want to be remembered, but because they know exactly how painful it feels to be forgotten. Back at the mansion, Malcolm didn't immediately return to work. He sat in his study for hours. $1 million contracts lay in front of him. But only one question echoed through his mind. Who exactly is Amina Brooks? He knew she was poor. He knew she was an orphan. He knew she came from one of Atlanta's toughest neighborhoods. But he couldn't understand what could make a 23-year-old girl sleep on a hospital floor for nearly 2 months, for a man who meant absolutely nothing to her. The next morning, Malcolm called his private attorney. His voice was low. "I want to know everything about Amina Brooks." The attorney hesitated. "Sir, everything means everything. Family, past, school, work, anyone who has ever been part of her life." The attorney nodded. "Yes, sir." But before he left, Malcolm added, "Don't let her know." 3 days later, a file was placed on Malcolm's desk. It wasn't thick, wasn't glamorous, didn't contain the billion-dollar numbers he was used to seeing in acquisition reports. It was simply the life of a poor girl, written in silent wounds. Malcolm opened the first page. Amina Brooks, born in Atlanta. Mother died when she was 6. Father Daniel Brooks, electric repair technician, died when Amina was 12. Malcolm's finger froze over the name. He kept reading. Amina had been brilliant in school. Not good, exceptional. For 3 straight years, she graduated at the top of her class. One teacher had written, "Amina Brooks has the potential to become a doctor, a lawyer, or anything she wants to be if life ever gives her a fair chance." Malcolm turned the page. A photocopied letter was clipped inside. A scholarship letter. A university in Georgia had offered Amina nearly a full scholarship to study nursing. Malcolm read that line again. Nursing. She had almost escaped poverty, almost worn a white uniform, almost built an entirely different life. But underneath, the report said, Amina Brooks declined enrollment. Reason: family financial hardship and caregiving responsibilities. Malcolm closed his eyes. Something inside him grew heavy. He turned another page. After giving up her scholarship, Amina worked night diners, laundry shops, hotels, gas stations. At one point, she worked 3 jobs at once. One former employer had written, there were days Amina fell asleep in the storage room from exhaustion, but she never stole even a single dollar. Then Malcolm reached the page that stopped his breathing. While he was in the hospital, Amina had received a full-time job offer at a senior care facility. The salary was far better than working as a maid. All she had to do was show up and sign. But she never went. Attached was a short note from the hiring manager. Miss Brooks said she couldn't leave the hospital right now. She said there was someone who needed to wake up without feeling alone. Malcolm slowly set the file down. The room suddenly felt too quiet. So quiet, he could hear his own heartbeat. He had thought he was saving companies, saving empires, saving million-dollar deals. But Amina had given up her chance at a better life, just to sit in a hallway, waiting for him to open his eyes. Then Malcolm turned to the final page. And that page shattered him. When Amina was 12 years old, her father had been injured in a workplace accident. He was rushed to a public hospital in critical condition. Because he lacked proper insurance, because paperwork was delayed, because the staff was overwhelmed, Daniel Brooks spent hours on a stretcher in a hallway. No room, no family, no one, except his little daughter. But that night, security forced Amina outside because children weren't allowed in emergency care after visiting hours. She sat outside the glass doors, crying until her voice gave out, begging to be let back in. No one let her. And just before sunrise, when a nurse finally opened the doors, it was too late. Daniel Brooks had died. Alone. No hand to hold. No one calling his name. No one telling him. His daughter was only a few steps away. When Malcolm finished reading, his hands began to shake. The file slipped from his fingers. And suddenly, he understood. Amina hadn't stayed only for him. She had stayed because of a promise made through the tears of a 12-year-old girl. A promise born on the most painful night of her life, that no one would ever have to die alone the way her father did. That afternoon, Malcolm told his driver to take him to Amina's apartment. No warning, no bodyguards, no flowers, no media. The black luxury car stopped in front of an old apartment building on the west side of Atlanta. Peeling paint, rusty iron stairs, electrical wires tangled above narrow alleyways. Malcolm stepped out. For the first time in years, his expensive leather shoes felt completely out of place, on cracked concrete. He stood in front of Amina's door and knocked softly. A moment later, the door opened. Amina stood there, wearing a simple t-shirt, her hair tied back in a hurry, a cleaning cloth still in her hand. She froze. "Mr. Jefferson?" Malcolm looked at her, and every word he had prepared vanished. Amina immediately glanced down the hallway. "You shouldn't be here." Her voice was soft. "This neighborhood isn't safe for you." Even now, her first instinct was to protect him, not ask why he came, not act impressed that a billionaire stood at her door. Just worry about him. And Malcolm couldn't take it anymore. He stepped inside. A tiny room, a single bed, an old table, a small electric stove, and on the wall, a faded photograph of a kind-looking black man. Malcolm looked at it. "Your father?" Amina nodded. Malcolm turned back toward her. His voice broke. "I know." Amina went silent. Then Malcolm slowly walked toward her. "Amina." For the first time, he said her name, without the cold distance of an employer. "I'm sorry." Amina looked up. "For what?" Malcolm swallowed hard. "Forever looking at you, like you didn't matter." Silence filled the room. Outside, sirens echoed in the distance. Malcolm continued. Every word pulled from the deepest part of his chest. "You lost everything, and still chose kindness, while I lost one person who betrayed me, and used that pain to punish the entire world." Amina's eyes filled with tears, and then, before her stunned eyes, the most powerful man in Atlanta slowly dropped to his knees, not out of pity, not to beg for love, but like a man who had finally realized he was standing before a soul far more valuable than anything money could ever buy. And from that day forward, Malcolm Jefferson was never the same man again. 1 year later, Atlanta had stepped into a brilliant spring. At the Street Regis Atlanta, where the wealthiest people in the American South often hosted million-dollar galas, an unforgettable wedding was about to begin. 3,000 guests, CEOs, politicians, movie stars, Wall Street investors. The same people who had always looked at Malcolm Jefferson as a symbol of money and power were all here today. But what had the entire city talking wasn't the luxury of the ceremony. It was the bride, Amina Brooks, the girl who had once walked into Jefferson Mansion carrying an old suitcase, the maid who used to mop the floors beneath the feet of the wealthy, the poor young woman who had slept on a hospital floor for 47 nights, just so one man wouldn't wake up alone. Today, Amina wore a wedding dress far simpler than anyone expected. No diamonds, no extravagant sparkle, just a soft white veil, a small bouquet of white flowers in her hands, and eyes as clear as the morning she first stepped into that cold mansion. As she entered the grand ballroom, thousands of heads turned. Some admired her, some were curious, some whispered, "She's so lucky. A maid, and now she gets this life? I wonder what she did to win Malcolm Jefferson." The words drifted past her like wind. Amina heard every one of them, but she never lowered her head. She had slept on hospital floors colder than their judgment. She had lost her father in a hallway where no one remembered his name. She had already been pushed so low by life that she had nothing left to lose. So today, as she walked down the white aisle, she didn't walk like someone who had been rescued. She walked like someone who had survived the storm without ever losing her heart. At the end of the aisle, Malcolm Jefferson stood waiting. His black tuxedo fit perfectly. Silver touched his hair, and the eyes that had once been colder than steel were now red with emotion. Just from seeing her, no one in the room could believe this was the same man who used to make executives tremble with nothing more than a glance. When Amina reached him, Malcolm held out his hand. She placed hers in his. Her hand still carried faint calluses. His fingers closed around it, gently, as if squeezing too hard might make this dream disappear. The ceremony began. The pastor spoke sacred words about love, loyalty, forgiveness. The ballroom fell silent. But Malcolm wasn't looking at the pastor. He was only looking at Amina. And in his eyes, an entire year came flooding back. The day she spilled coffee on his $20,000 suit, the night he collapsed in his office, ambulance lights tearing through the rain, the freezing hospital hallway, her old coat spread across cold tile, and Amina's smile through the ICU glass, the night he woke up in tears. Then, when it came time to exchange vows, Malcolm suddenly raised his hand. "Please, stop." A murmur swept through the crowd. The host looked confused. Guests exchanged glances. No one knew what was happening. Malcolm turned toward the massive screen behind the stage. He signaled to the technicians. The lights slowly dimmed. The giant screen flickered to life. At first, everyone assumed it would be a glamorous love story. Private jets, luxury villas, yachts, roses, perfectly staged moments for a billionaire wedding. But no. Instead, the screen showed a hospital hallway, cold white lights, gray tile floors, a closed ICU door, and right there, curled up on an old coat, was Amina. The entire ballroom froze. No clinking glasses, no whispers, no cameras, only the sound of rain from old security footage and the quiet, uneven breathing of 3,000 people watching. It was Amina. No wedding dress, no jewelry, no spotlight, just Amina, through 47 freezing nights. Bare feet curled from the cold, cracked hands resting against her chest, apalefatse, exhausted from sleepless nights. And yet, there was still a faint smile on her lips. A smile with no performance, no audience, no calculation. Malcolm picked up a microphone. His voice came out low and trembling. That day, he pointed toward the screen. "I was lying behind that door. No expensive suits. No stock prices. No power. Nothing. Except a weak heart. Trying to beat. One more time." "Is the day end?" The room was absolutely silent. Malcolm turned toward the audience. "My family wasn't there." A few people lowered their eyes. "My friends never called." He paused. "My business partners only wanted to know if the company would survive." The room grew heavy. People who had sent flowers after his recovery couldn't lift their heads. Malcolm looked back at the screen. "But there was one person." He turned toward Amina. "No one hired you. No one paid you. No contract ever asked you to sleep on a hospital floor for 47 nights. Amina stood frozen. Her eyes filled with tears. Malcolm continued. "When I was no longer Malcolm Jefferson, the billionaire, when I was nothing more than a dying patient, you stayed." A quiet sob came from the front row. Then another. Then another. Politicians who were used to commanding crowds fell silent. CEOs who negotiated billion-dollar deals lowered their heads. Because this was no longer a story about wealth. It was about something many of them had never truly seen. Love without a price tag. Malcolm set down the microphone. He walked toward Amina. And then, in front of 3,000 people, he slowly dropped to one knee. The entire ballroom stopped breathing. Amina covered her mouth. "Malcolm," he took her hand. The same hand that had once cleaned his floors. The same hand that had held a trembling coffee cup. The same hand that had touched the ICU glass, waiting for him to wake up. He bowed his head and kissed those faint calluses. Then he looked up. Tears streamed down the face of the most powerful man in Atlanta. "You never loved my money." His voice broke. "You loved me when I was nothing more than a man close to death." Amina cried, but she smiled through her tears. Malcolm held her hand tighter. "So today," he spoke slowly, each word sounding like a vow carved into his soul. "Let me love you for the rest of my life." No one clapped. Not right away, because everyone was crying. Then Amina slowly knelt in front of him. She placed both hands on his face and softly whispered, "I never needed you to be the richest man alive." She looked deep into his eyes. "I only needed you to stop abandoning your own heart." Malcolm broke down, and the ballroom erupted. Thunderous applause, people standing, tears everywhere. But Malcolm and Amina heard none of it, because in their world, there were only two hands, holding on, at last. Lauder, when Malcolm slipped the ring onto her finger, it wasn't the biggest diamond his designers had suggested. It was something simpler. Inside, engraved with just 4 words, 47 nights, 1 lifetime. And in that moment, everyone finally understood. Malcolm Jefferson had never lifted Amina out of poverty. It was Amina Brooks who had pulled Malcolm Jefferson out of the darkness. And for the first time in his life, Malcolm Jefferson was no longer afraid of tomorrow. Because now he knew, even if money disappeared, even if the world turned away, even if life brought him back to another cold hallway someday, there would always be one hand that stayed. Not for money, not for status, but for love.